The station at the edge of the empire had a name so long no one used it. Everyone just called it Rimwake, partly because it hung above a cold blue world in a permanent half-dawn, and partly because saying its official title aloud gave people the expression of someone trying to swallow a metal spoon. Irene Vale hated Rimwake on sight. He hated the docking clamps that shrieked like offended animals. He hated the corridor lights that blinked half a second too late, as if the station was thinking hard about whether he deserved illumination. He hated the customs drone that floated in front of him and said, for the third time in the same flat voice, "State the purpose of your visit." "I am here," Irene said, dead tired, "because poor life choices form habits." The drone emitted a polite chime. "Unrecognized purpose. State the purpose of your visit." "Cargo delivery." "Accepted." The drone floated aside with the serene dignity of a machine that had won an argument. Irene adjusted the strap of his transit bag and moved into the station's main spine, where the air smelled faintly of ionized metal, engine coolant, and expensive perfume, trying very hard to defeat both. Rimwake was a trading post, a refueling hub, a military checkpoint, a gossip exchange, and a place where the Empire's authority became thin enough that everyone smiled with one hand near a concealed weapon. He preferred stations where people were honest about being dangerous. His ship, the Dust Runner, had come in on a delayed contract carrying replacement field coils, sealed med packs, and 3 crates of agricultural processors destined for a colony that apparently believed turnips were a matter of strategic importance. His job was simple: deliver the cargo, get paid, leave before anyone invented additional paperwork. He had nearly reached the freight lift when his wrist console vibrated. He glanced down and saw a message from the ship's maintenance system. "Warning, port thruster 3 requires inspection." He stared at it. "Of course you do," he muttered. "Why wouldn't you? Everyone else on this station is choosing this moment to disappoint me." The console chirped again. "Additional note, this is a friendly reminder." "You are a machine," Irene said. "You are not friendly." A passing porter, 6 eyes and no visible patience, glanced at him and sped up. Rimwake's market ring opened ahead in a burst of sound. Traders called across stalls in 4 languages and one aggressive series of whistles. Hollow signs fluttered above kiosks selling synthetic fruit, navigation keys, reactor seals, antiques of deeply suspicious origin, and tea that promised spiritual clarity and probably delivered stomach pain. Irene stepped around a pair of engineers arguing over a gravity inverter and stopped at a kiosk for calf. The vendor was a compact woman with silver implants braided along her jawline and the expression of someone who had seen everything twice and found none of it impressive. "1 calf," Irene said. She handed him a cup without looking up. "That'll be 6 marks." "6. Yesterday on Vesh it was 3. Then go drink yesterday on Vesh." He stared at her, then took a careful sip. It was bitter enough to revive dead ancestors. "All right," he admitted. "This is excellent extortion. That's the spirit." He moved on, warmer now, drifting with the crowd along the ring. A patrol column crossed the upper bridge in lacquered dark armor, too polished for ordinary station security. Imperial. Their helmets reflected market lights in long, sharp bands. People noticed them without appearing to notice them, which was an old and universal skill. Irene looked away first. The Empire had a way of making ordinary men feel accidentally guilty. It did not matter if you were innocent. Their uniforms suggested they would eventually find something. He passed a viewport wide enough to show the blue curve of the planet below, and beyond it, a scatter of ships hanging in traffic lanes like metal seeds in black water. Farther out, the defense satellites glimmered faintly. Beyond those, space, not empty, never empty, just too large to care. His console buzzed again. New message. Payment released upon confirmed delivery. "Ah," Irene said. A sentence crafted by people who have never once hurried. He took the lower transit corridor toward cargo processing. The market noise dimmed behind him, replaced by the deeper mechanical heartbeat of the station. Conduits hummed within the walls. Magnetic rails whispered under the floor. Service drones zipped through ceiling tracks carrying sealed canisters and urgent little opinions. He liked this part better. Machines lied less. At Processing Gate 12, a clerk in Station Gray scanned his manifest, frowned, rescanned it, and frowned harder. "There's a hold on Crate Group B." "There cannot be a hold on Crate Group B," Irene said. "Crate Group B contains agricultural processors, unless the Empire has recently declared war on root vegetables." The clerk, who had clearly heard every variety of complaint humanity could produce, remained unmoved. "Secondary authorization required." "From whom?" The clerk tapped his terminal. "Office of Outer Transit Oversight." Irene closed his eyes. "That sounds imaginary. It exists. That makes it worse." The clerk slid a datapad toward him. "Fill these." Irene looked down at a document so long it had a table of contents. "I think this form is old enough to vote." The clerk blinked once. "Fill these." Irene took the pad and moved to the side terminal, muttering under his breath. "Name, vessel registration, cargo classification, route origin, route destination, declaration of non-military intent, declaration of non-biological contamination, declaration that he was not knowingly transporting self-aware spores." He paused there. "Knowingly," he murmured. "A very comforting loophole." Around him, workers pushed freight sleds in practiced lines. A pair of station hands laughed too loudly at something on a private comm channel. Somewhere above, an alarm gave a short single tone and then stopped. Irene looked up. No one else reacted. The station kept moving. He went back to the form. Then the floor shivered. Not hard, not enough to throw anyone. Just a brief, wrong vibration that ran through the structure like a muscle twitch. Several people paused. Overhead lights dimmed, brightened, then stabilized. One of the station hands swore. The clerk finally looked concerned. He touched the side of his terminal. "Power fluctuation in the outer ring," he said, mostly to himself. "Is that bad?" Irene asked. The clerk gave him a long look. "On a station. Fair." Another tone sounded, longer this time. The air changed. Irene felt it before he understood it. A subtle shift in pressure, the kind that made the skin along his arms tighten. People began checking messages. A service drone shot past at reckless speed. Farther down the corridor, a bulkhead seal indicator went from green to amber. "All right," Irene said quietly. "I officially dislike this." The station lights flickered again, and this time they did not recover cleanly. Half the corridor dropped into shadow while emergency strips along the floor flared blue. Somewhere metal screamed. Not a little squeal from stressed machinery. A full-body shriek, deep and violent. Then the announcement system woke up all at once. "Attention," said a voice that was trying too hard to sound calm. "Temporary containment protocols have been initiated in sectors." Static cut it off. A beat later another voice, definitely not calm, shouted over open-channel traffic. "Field failure in outer docking lattice." "Repeat, field failure." The rest vanished in distortion. Everything changed at once. The amber bulkhead lights snapped red. Half the workers ran for the inner doors. The other half froze, which in a crisis was a proud and ancient tradition. Irene dropped the datapad on instinct and turned toward the source of the noise. Through the open maintenance arch at the end of the corridor, he could see flashes of white-blue light strobing from the outer platform. A man barreled past him yelling into a comm, "Vent seal, S gone. Get pressure screens online." Irene caught his arm. "What happened?" The man yanked free. "Docking lattice overload, outer platforms bleeding atmosphere." That was enough. He ran, not because it was wise. Wisdom had already left the building, probably through an emergency hatch. He ran because there were people out there, and because once his body started moving his mind had no chance to object. He hit the maintenance arch and burst onto the outer transit platform. The world became noise. Warning sirens wailed. Emergency fields shimmered in broken sections along the platform edge, some holding, some guttering like bad lanterns. Cargo containers had overturned. A loader mech lay on its side with one leg sheared off and sparking. The stars beyond the fractured shield line looked much too close. Crew and travelers scrambled toward the inner doors as station techs fought to stabilize a collapsing field node. The platform shook again, and Irene saw the problem at once. One of the anchor pylons had blown open. Energy was arcing in vicious white ropes across the deck. Someone screamed. He turned. Near the damaged edge, a woman had gone down hard beside a split service rail. Her travel cloak had snagged on exposed metal. Each time she tried to rise, the failing gravity along that section dragged her sideways toward the breach. Two others had nearly reached her, but a burst of arcing current drove them back. For one suspended instant the whole scene sharpened, the broken rail, the open dark beyond it, the woman on the deck. The long ears swept back against her hair, human and not human. She looked up, and even across the chaos he saw that she was not panicking. She was measuring, calculating, alive and 1 second from not being. Irene heard himself say with weary disbelief, "Oh, that's definitely my problem now." Then he sprinted toward her as the platform trembled under his feet. He hit the broken section of the platform at full speed, and immediately regretted every decision that had led him to this point, including learning to walk. The deck lurched under him. Artificial gravity snapped sideways for half a breath, turning his sprint into a crooked stumble. He slammed one hand against a ruptured support strut, caught himself, and nearly lost 2 fingers to a burst of heat. "Excellent," he muttered. "A rescue, my least profitable hobby." The woman was still pinned beside the split service rail. A torn length of fabric had twisted around the exposed metal and locked tight. Behind her, the fractured edge of the platform opened onto a hard scatter of stars and the pale arc of the planet below. Emergency field screens fluttered on and off in ragged bands. Every time one failed, the air pulled at loose debris with a hungry hiss. A station tech crouched behind an overturned cargo sled and shouted, "Don't go farther, the deck's unstable." Irene shouted back, "I know. I'm making a very informed mistake." He dropped low as another lash of white-blue current cracked across the floor in front of him. The smell of scorched metal bit the back of his throat. He pulled his utility cutter from his belt, checked the charge gauge, and frowned. 41%, he said to it. So we both came unprepared. The woman looked at him as if he were either insane or inconveniencing her schedule. Her face remained calm, but he could see the effort in the way she held herself against the drag toward the breach. "You need to move," he called. "That is," she answered evenly, "what I have been attempting." Her voice startled him. It was level, precise, and somehow more composed than the station's emergency system had been. It did not sound like someone moments from death. It sounded like someone displeased by inefficient circumstances. "That's good," Irene said, inching closer. "Stay with that attitude." The platform shuddered. A warning klaxon changed pitch. Somewhere behind them, something large tore free with a shriek of metal. He reached the split rail and dropped beside her. Up close, the not-human parts of her were unmistakable. The long ears angled back through dark hair, elegant even now, and there was something in her eyes that made him think of distant stars seen through clean glass, cold only until the light found them right. The thought annoyed him. He was in the middle of a disaster. This was not the time to become poetic. "You're caught," he said. "Yes, I can see that. I was trying to establish teamwork." Her gaze flicked to the cutter in his hand. "The rail is magnetized. Cut the fabric, not the metal." "Good, you know what's happening. That saves time." "I generally prefer it when people know what's happening." "That must be hard for you today." A flicker touched her expression. Not quite a smile. Something smaller, sharper. He set the cutter to fine edge and sawed through the twisted fabric where it had cinched around the rail. The first pass scorched it but didn't sever it. He adjusted, cursed softly, tried again. The gravity stuttered. For one impossible second his stomach rose into his throat. Loose bolts and shards of plating lifted around them. Then the pull reversed toward the breach, violent enough to wrench his shoulder. He grabbed the service rail with his free hand and felt the woman's fingers lock around his wrist. The emergency screen died. Air screamed past them. The tech behind the cargo sled vanished from view as a pressure barrier snapped down between support pylons farther back. It held the main corridor, but this section of deck was now open to vacuum except for the wavering local field nodes trying and mostly failing to save them. Irene bared his teeth. You know where I'm from, this counts as poor customer service. Her grip tightened. She leaned close enough that he could hear her over the howl. Can you sever it or not? Yes, he said. I just need the universe to stop improvising. He jammed the cutter into the fabric again. Sparks jumped. The final twist parted. Move, he shouted. She pushed off the rail at the same moment another shock ran through the deck. The damaged plating beneath them buckled. Instead of sliding cleanly back toward safety, she skidded sideways straight toward the broken edge. Irene lunged. His hand caught her wrist just as her lower body dropped past the torn lip of the platform. Momentum yanked him after her hard enough to wrench a curse from his lungs. His chest slammed the deck. His legs kicked into empty air. The cutter flew from his hand and vanished into the black. For a second the entire universe narrowed to pain, slipping metal, and the weight of another life hanging from his arm. Well, he gasped, this has become extremely personal. Below him she hung suspended against the cold void, one hand gripping his forearm now, the other pressed against the hull plating to keep from spinning. Her face remained eerily controlled, but even she could not hide the strain in her shoulders. You should let go, she said. No, you cannot brace properly. That sounds like tomorrow's problem. It is very much this moment's problem. He tried to find purchase with his free hand and got only a handful of scorched deck plating. The edge bit into his ribs. Somewhere above, red emergency lights strobed in slow, malicious rhythm. The woman looked up at him, long ears flattened back by the pull of escaping air. If you release me now, you may live. That is a terrible sales pitch. It is mathematically sound. I'm offended by the lack of optimism. Another section of field flared to life nearby, dimming the airflow for a heartbeat before collapsing again. It was enough to let him drag in a sharper breath. He twisted, hooked his elbow around a jag of ruptured plating and hauled upward with everything his spine would later resent. She rose inches, then slipped. He almost lost her. Right, he said through clenched teeth. New rule, no more slipping. I'm already using all my panic. And then, absurdly, she laughed. Not loudly, not for long. Just a breath of sound almost stolen by the wind but unmistakable. He stared down at her. Did you just laugh? You are ridiculous. Yes, he said, a trait that becomes heroic under pressure. He dragged again, muscles burned, vision narrowed. The woman kicked off the hull, understanding at once what he needed. Together they managed another hard jolt upward until he could catch the edge of her shoulder with his other hand. A cable dropped from above and smacked the deck beside his head. Grab it! Someone shouted. Irene glanced up. Two station workers lay flat on the platform several meters back, anchored by harness lines, extending a mag cable toward him with the miserable expressions of people who knew this should absolutely be someone else's job. Oh good, Irene shouted back. Reinforcements. I was seconds away from becoming a cautionary poster. He released the ruptured plating just long enough to seize the cable loop and snap it around his forearm. Magnetic teeth locked. The workers heaved. The pull nearly tore his arm from its socket, but it moved them. Inch by ugly inch, he and the woman scraped over the broken lip of the platform and slammed onto solid deck. For several seconds nobody moved. Irene lay on his back staring at the flashing red lights above him, lungs trying to negotiate a new treaty with air. Beside him, the woman pushed herself up on one elbow, breathing hard but controlled. The workers unclipped the cable and staggered away. one of them shouting something about field stabilization and hazard pay. Irene raised a shaking finger toward the ceiling. "I would like," he said hoarsely, "to file a formal complaint with whoever designed today." The woman turned her head toward him. Up close, with the immediate terror temporarily postponed, he saw details he had missed. The strange precision in her features, the alert stillness behind her fatigue, the fine metallic thread stitched into the collar of her torn cloak. Not expensive, not exactly. Important, deliberate. "You are injured," she said. He looked down. Blood ran from a tear across his sleeve where the deck edge had stripped skin from his arm. "Barely. My pride took the main hit." Her eyes stayed on him, evaluating again. Measuring him the way she had at the edge, except now there was something else in it. Curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. "You should have released me," she said quietly. "Yes, well," Irene replied, forcing himself upright. "I make many bad choices, but I try to be consistent." Before she could answer, a squad of armored guards burst onto the platform through the emergency seal. They moved with brutal efficiency, helmets dark, insignia bright against polished chest plates. Not station security. Imperial. Every worker nearby went suddenly still. The guards fanned out, weapons lowered but ready. Their commander crossed directly to the woman, dropped to one knee and bowed his head. "My queen," he said, voice tight with controlled alarm. "Are you harmed?" Irene stopped halfway through standing. He looked at the guards, then at the woman, then back at the guards. "No," he said faintly. "No, absolutely not." The woman rose to her feet with unhurried grace despite the wreckage around them. Torn cloak, scorched sleeve, hair half loose in the emergency wind. And still she somehow looked more composed than anyone else on the platform. "My injuries are minor," she said. The commander looked at Irene then, really looked at him, and the temperature of the universe seemed to drop 10 degrees. Irene pointed weakly at himself. "Before anyone decides anything dramatic, I'd like to state for the record that I had no idea she was royalty. I thought she was just a regular person in terrible danger, which, in fairness, she was." No one answered. The guards straightened. The workers backed away. Even the siren seemed, for one insulting moment, quieter. The woman turned toward him fully. He became very aware of the blood on his sleeve, the soot on his clothes, and the fact that he was one sarcastic remark away from being vaporized by a monarchy. She studied him in silence. Then she said, "Bring him." Irene blinked. "That is not as reassuring as you think it is." They did not bind his hands, which Irene found somehow more unsettling than if they had. He walked between two imperial guards through corridors that became progressively cleaner, quieter, and more expensive-looking in the sort of way that made ordinary people instinctively check whether their boots were allowed on the floor. No one explained where they were taking him. No one answered when he asked. The only sounds were the measured impact of armored steps, the muted hum of transit systems behind the walls, and the occasional distant station alert reminding everyone that Rimwake was still in the middle of a crisis. "I appreciate the silence," Irene said after the first 5 minutes. "It really gives my imagination room to worsen the situation." The guard to his right did not even turn his head. "That was a joke," Irene added. The guard to his left said, "We know." That, unfortunately, was worse. They passed through a cylindrical security chamber where pale blue light scanned over him in slow bands. His wrist console chirped in protest, then died completely. "Oh good," he muttered. "Now I'm alone with my thoughts. This is the Empire's cruelest weapon." A technician behind the scan wall glanced at a display. "No concealed weapons." "Emotionally," Irene said, "I'm very armed." The technician looked tired enough to let that pass. The inner levels of Rimwake were different from the market rings and freight corridors. The station still shook occasionally from repair efforts, but here the panic had been edited out. Doors opened before the escort reached them. Personnel in dark uniforms stepped aside instantly. Information walls scrolled lines of code, traffic reports, shield diagnostics, fleet positions. Irene caught fragments as he walked. Outer lattice collapse contained. Unidentified sabotage vector under review. Royal vessel secure. Transit lockdown extended. He slowed half a step. Royal vessel. He looked ahead at the back of the guard on his left. All right, hypothetically, let's say a man saved someone important without knowing who she was. No reply. And then, purely hypothetically, armed professionals escorted him through increasingly intimidating architecture. Nothing. In such a case, Irene said, would the hypothetical man be facing a reward, a trial, or ceremonial disintegration? The guard on the right finally answered, "Keep walking." That sounds like trial or disintegration. He was taken not to a cell, but to a chamber overlooking an interior hangar. That surprised him enough to silence him for a full 3 seconds. The room was circular, sparse, and far too elegant to belong to anyone who had ever filled out cargo forms. A transparent wall curved along one side, revealing a docked vessel shaped like a shard of midnight, its hull lined with faint silver geometry that seemed to shift when he looked away and then back. Irene stepped toward the glass despite himself. "Well," he said softly, "that's absurd." One of the guards remained by the door. The other moved to a wall terminal and stood there like a statue pretending it had career ambitions. Irene squinted at the vessel below. "That's not standard Imperial design." No answer. Too graceful, too expensive. Looks like it was engineered by someone who thought intimidation should also be art. Still nothing. He turned from the glass. "You people are exhausting." Minutes passed, or an hour. Time became slippery when one was waiting to discover whether saving a stranger had counted as charity, treason, or marriage. A service drone arrived with water and a med patch, deposited both on a low table and left without acknowledging him. He stared at the med patch. Interesting. They want me alive enough to heal. He applied it anyway. The patch hissed cool against the torn skin on his arm, knitting the worst of the damage. By the time he finished, the door behind him opened. Everyone in the room straightened. He turned. The woman from the platform entered without ceremony, and somehow brought ceremony with her anyway. She had changed into dark formal garments traced with narrow metallic lines that caught the light when she moved. The tears and soot were gone. The quiet was not. 2 attendants followed and stopped near the door, but she came farther in alone. Her ears were uncovered now, long and elegant, angled slightly back in a way he had begun to suspect meant she was thinking several layers ahead of everyone else. Irene set the used med patch down carefully. "That's usually a bad sign," he said, "when someone looks much more royal after you've already embarrassed yourself in front of them." She stopped across from him. "You are unsettled." "Yes." "You admit it easily. It saves time." That almost smile appeared again, so brief he might have imagined it. "You are Irene Vale." He blinked. "You checked." "I do not make declarations about strangers without learning their names." Something in the phrasing caught his attention, but not enough to distract from the larger problem. "About that," he said, "I would love clarification before I die of interpretation. You assume death very quickly." "I was dragged into the private sector of an imperial station by armed guards after pulling a queen out of a vacuum breach. I feel I'm showing restraint." She regarded him for a moment, then moved past him toward the transparent wall. The hangar vessel waited below like a thought too expensive to speak aloud. "My name," she said, "is Aaron Vasolis, sovereign of the Telari Ascendancy, keeper of the Eastern Corridors and voice of the living throne." Irene exhaled slowly. "That is an aggressively impressive introduction. It is shortened." He stared at her profile. "You're joking." "No, that is somehow funnier." She looked back at him then, and there it was again, that impossible composure, threaded now with clear intelligence and a kind of restrained amusement that suggested she was not used to being surprised and did not entirely dislike it. "The human habit of answering fear with humor," she said, "is I noticed." For a moment they stood in a silence that did not feel empty. The station thrummed around them. Somewhere beyond the walls, repair crews were still patching ruptures, rerouting systems, lying bravely to malfunctioning machines. But inside the room, the center of things had shifted. Irene rubbed the back of his neck. "So what happens now?" Aaron studied him. "You expected imprisonment. I still do a little. You saved my life. Accidentally. You acted deliberately. I mean, I accidentally saved a queen. I was aiming for person. That distinction matters less to me than it does to my court." "That," Irene said, "is exactly the sort of sentence that gives ordinary men heart conditions." She moved to the low table, lifted the untouched glass of water, and offered it to him. He took it carefully, because refusing drinks from royalty seemed like the kind of mistake historians enjoyed. "My court will ask why I declared you mine," she said. He nearly inhaled the water wrong. "Excellent, because I was also going to ask that, but with more panic. It is an old Telari form." He lowered the glass slowly. "That explanation has not improved anything. It is not ownership." "Yes, you said that. Unfortunately, the phrase has not stopped sounding like a very dramatic kidnapping. It means this: one who has proven beyond law that they stand within my protection and regard." He stared at her. She continued in that level voice that somehow made every word land harder. "A person may be loyal because they are ordered, a soldier because they are trained, a courtier because they seek favor, but one who chooses without knowledge reveals something purer. Such a person, once recognized, cannot be treated as ordinary by the throne." Irene took a long drink of water because his mouth had stopped cooperating. "In human terms," he said, "is this closer to a mental political asylum or a lifelong administrative complication?" Aaron considered. "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly. "I knew it." One of the attendants stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the council is assembled." "Of course they are," Irene murmured. "Nothing attracts politicians like a disaster and a new procedural crisis." Aaron's gaze remained on him. "They will object. To me, to what I said, to what it means, to what comes next." "Which is?" She walked toward the door, then stopped close enough that he could see the faint reflective lines at her collar and the calmer, stranger thing in her eyes. "You will stand beside me," she said, "while they learn that the moment on the platform changed more than my survival." Irene gave a weak laugh. "I was afraid you might say that. You may continue making jokes in the council chamber if it helps you remain upright. That is the most generous threat I've ever received." This time the smile lingered. Then the door opened, and from beyond it came the distant murmur of gathered power preparing to become a problem. The council chamber was built for intimidation, which meant it was circular, elevated, and full of people who had perfected the art of sitting, as if the fate of civilizations depended on their posture. Irene decided within 3 seconds that he disliked everyone in it, not personally. He did not know them well enough yet, but collectively, yes. He entered beside Queen Erin beneath a vaulted canopy of suspended light panels that displayed shifting star maps of the eastern corridors. Trade routes glowed in blue. Defense lanes pulsed in gold. At the chamber's center, above a recessed projection field, Rimwake rotated in a silver holographic sphere, its outer lattice flashing red where the sabotage had struck. The effect was elegant, informative, and somehow judgmental. The council turned toward them as one. Irene would later reflect that being stared at by 30 powerful people in ceremonial armor and diplomatic silks felt very similar to walking into a room and realizing everyone had already heard the worst version of your story. He kept his expression neutral through immense discipline and several internal screams. Erin walked ahead without pause. She ascended the central dais and took her place before the throne interface rather than on it, which seemed to mean something, because at least 6 council members grew immediately more alert. Irene stopped where an attendant indicated, slightly below her right side, visible to everyone, which he suspected was not an accident and definitely not a kindness. A tall man with silver bands braided into his dark uniform spoke first. "Your Majesty," he said, voice smooth enough to hide knives in, "we are relieved beyond measure by your safety." Irene glanced at him and thought, that man has absolutely smiled during at least one execution. Aaron answered, your relief honors the moment, Lord Terran. Let us hope your clarity does the same. A faint ripple moved through the chamber. Not sound. Attention changing shape. Lord Terran bowed his head just enough to remain technically respectful. Then clarity is exactly what we seek. Rimwake suffered a coordinated systems compromise during your transit inspection. We have begun internal review. The attack vector appears sophisticated. Appears? Aaron asked. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. The forensic teams are still compiling. The anchor pylon was overloaded from inside the station grid, she said. The response delay on the outer platform was extended by false signal traffic routed through administrative lattice channels. The escort reassignment that placed me there originated under a council-level authorization key. No one moved. Irene, who had spent his adult life around smugglers, brokers, captains, and the occasional dock official whose ethics were mostly decorative, recognized the moment instantly. It was the moment when everyone in the room realized the conversation had arrived much earlier than expected. A woman in pale, metallic robes leaned forward. Your Majesty, are you suggesting betrayal within the Ascendancy's own command structure? Irene thought that suggesting was a generous word for what she had just done. Aaron did not raise her voice. She never seemed to need to. I am stating that someone used the architecture of my government to engineer my death. A different counselor spoke, older mechanical lenses nested around one eye. Then the chamber should be sealed and the outsider removed. Several heads turned toward Irene. He lifted a hand. I'd like to say in my defense I was having a terrible day long before I entered your politics. No one laughed. One person looked offended that sound remained legal. Aaron said, he stays. The old counselor's voice hardened. Majesty, with respect, this human is unknown, unvetted, and now inserted into a crisis at the highest level. He may be an opportunist, a witness, or part of the design. Irene nodded slowly. I do appreciate being offered 3 bad options instead of 1. Still, no laughter. He began to understand why empires eventually collapsed. They refused humor until reality was forced to do it for them. Aaron turned her head slightly toward him. You may speak. Irene stared at her. That feels dangerous. It is. Good, just checking. He looked across the chamber, 30 faces, 2 controlled, 2 practiced, some curious, some hostile. Some already calculating what new alignment of power might emerge if the Queen survived an assassination attempt and attached political significance to the cargo pilot who prevented it. He had never wanted less to be interesting. I don't know your protocols, he said. I don't know your factions, I barely know your station. What I do know is this, whatever happened on that platform, it wasn't chaos, it was timed. Several eyes narrowed. Encouraged despite himself, he continued. The outer ring alarm started before the main failure. Some workers heard a localized warning before the official station alert. Then the system announcement got cut by open channel interference. If you wanted a real emergency response, you de-isolate the channel and lock routing priority. Instead, someone made sure confusion arrived first. The woman in metallic robe studied him. You inferred this in the midst of a near-fatal breach. I infer better when annoyed. A faint, impossible sound escaped Aaron then, not laughter, the beginning of it. Lord Terran folded his hands behind his back. A dock pilot's observations are not evidence. No, Irene said, but they are annoying in the direction of evidence. The chamber's central hologram shifted. Rimwake expanded, layers of its system's architecture unfolding in luminous grids. Aaron touched the interface with 2 fingers. Data streams flared above the recessed field. Timing stamps, access threads, channel reroutes, lattice disruptions. Irene stared despite himself. That is an absurdly beautiful way to accuse people. One of the counselors muttered something in Telari. Irene didn't understand the words, but the tone translated perfectly into, why is he still talking? Erin moved her hand through the projection, isolating 3 signal paths. The sabotage used internal civilian maintenance corridors to mask military-grade code intrusion. Elegant, patient, wastefully clever. Lord Tarrant said, then the attacker wished your death to resemble institutional failure. Yes. Which benefits external enemies as much as internal rivals. Erin's gaze remained on the data. Do you advise me to look outward first? I advise caution before naming ghosts in this room. Erin looked at him. Lord Tarrant was good, calm, reasonable. That special kind of reasonable that made a man sound wise while building a wall around the obvious. He leaned slightly toward Erin. I don't trust him. Half the chamber inhaled. Lord Tarrant smiled with dangerous grace. How refreshingly direct. Yes, Erin said. I'm not from here. I haven't learned how to turn suspicion into poetry. The old counselor spoke again. Majesty, this is exactly why the declaration must be reconsidered. The phrase itself has already spread through the station. Your guards could not contain it. Every deck now repeats that the Queen claimed a human before the court. Merchants are betting on meanings. Pilots are inventing ballads. By tomorrow, the Imperial relays will have a version involving prophecy. Erin grimaced. I hate that for me. Erin's eyes sharpened. The declaration stands. The chamber tightened. A younger counselor, military by posture if not uniform, said carefully, then we request formal clarification for the record. Erin rested one hand on the edge of the throne interface. Very well. The Telari phrase renders poorly into trade speech. In court language, it signifies bond by sovereign recognition, one whose act has entered the living authority of the throne, one who is not owned but claimed into protection, regard, and remembered obligation. Erin murmured, that is still alarmingly intense. She continued as if he had not spoken, though he noticed 2 nearby attendants trying very hard not to react. Such recognition is rare because it cannot be awarded for service rendered under order. It must arise from ungoverned choice. The woman in metallic robes said, then your majesty binds precedent to emotion. Erin's answer came like a blade laid on silk. No, I bind law to truth. Silence. Erin had no idea what any of this meant in practical terms, but he knew a room losing ground when he saw one. Lord Tarrant shifted strategy. If the declaration stands, then the human becomes inseparable from the political consequences. He will be targeted, manipulated, examined, and perhaps used against you by those who would insult the bond through him. Erin raised a hand again. I would like the minutes to reflect that I strongly preferred my previous life, where the greatest threat was unpaid maintenance. Erin looked at him then, and her voice softened just enough that the chamber noticed. I am aware. That was worse somehow, worse because it sounded like she meant it. A pulse of light flashed across the central hologram. One of the side analysts stiffened over her console. Majesty, she said, incoming priority intercept from station security, another breach. Every head turned. The analyst expanded the feed. A section of the map lit amber, then crimson. Storage Tier 6. Civilian dock records. Transit manifests. Lord Tarrant frowned. What now? The analyst's voice sharpened. Someone is wiping arrival and departure logs from the last 12 hours. Erin spoke before he could stop himself. That's not cleanup. That's retreat. Erin snapped commands into the chamber. Seal all relay exits. Lock data cores to throne authority. No external burst transmissions without my key. The younger military counselor was already moving. Intercept teams en route. The old counselor rounded on Erin as though the idea offended him on principle. If records are being purged, then someone fears identification. Erin said, yes, that's generally how guilt markets itself. And then it hit him. A small, ugly thought arriving late and all at once. He looked at the station map, at the red bloom in storage Tier 6 at the cargo sectors attached to civilian routing, then at Lord Tarrant, then back at the map. Oh no, he said. Erin caught it immediately. What? My ship. He stepped toward the hologram, forgetting for one suicidal second that he was in a royal council and not arguing over a port invoice. The dust runner is docked on the civilian maintenance spur connected to those transit lanes. If someone's erasing records, they don't just want names gone. They want routes erased, which means ships go missing next. The analyst checked. Her face changed. A maintenance override has just been issued to berth cluster 9. Irene felt his stomach drop. That's me, Lord Terran said. One freighter is irrelevant compared to... It is not irrelevant, Aaron cut in. If the attackers entered through civilian infrastructure, then civilian movement may conceal their escape. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices. At last, Irene thought, a proper disaster. Everyone speaking at once like civilization was only a rumor. Aaron lifted one hand. The chamber fell silent so fast it was almost frightening. She looked at Irene. Can your ship move? He blinked. You are asking whether my underfunded, emotionally unstable freighter can suddenly become useful under pressure. Yes. He thought of the old thruster warning, Port 3, the maintenance alert, the endless small indignities of honest work. Then he grinned despite everything. Technically, poorly, but yes. Aaron turned to the council. Then while you continue deciding which traditions offend you most, I will pursue the ones trying to erase themselves. Lord Terran's composure cracked by a single degree. Majesty, you cannot mean to leave the chamber now. I do. You would depart with him. Aaron stepped down from the dais. The star maps turned slowly over her shoulders. Her answer landed with terrifying calm. Yes, she said. He is mine. The dust runner protested the moment Irene forced power through her systems. I hear you, he told the console as warning icons bloomed across the panel. Your feelings are valid. We are still launching. Aaron stood behind the pilot's seat, one hand braced against the overhead rail as the freighter shuddered in its berth. 2 Telari guard officers had attempted to join them at the dock. She had dismissed them with a glance so calm it somehow counted as an order, a warning, and a philosophical argument. Now it was just the two of them, a cargo pilot and a queen, strapped into a ship whose maintenance history could be charitably described as aspirational. The console flashed again. Port Thruster 3 requires inspection. Yes, Irene said. Thank you, I had almost forgotten. Aaron settled into the co-pilot position with the focused stillness of someone who had flown before, though probably not in anything that rattled this much. Your vessel speaks often. It nags, there's a difference. I am beginning to understand why you do the same. He shot her a glance. That sounded dangerously close to affection. Do not become overconfident. The berth locks released. Outside the forward screen, Rimwake's damaged outer ring turned slowly against the stars, repair drones swarming around the wounded docking lattice. Traffic control was a mess of clipped instructions, rerouted departures, and the rising panic of officials discovering that a queen had decided procedure was optional. Irene pushed the dust runner clear of the berth and felt the ship drag sideways before the stabilizers caught. There, he said, Grace. That word is doing heroic work. A burst transmission hit the comm channel. Lord Terran's voice controlled as ever. Your Majesty, return to secured command. Intercept teams are moving. This pursuit is unnecessary. Aaron leaned toward the console and keyed the reply herself. If it were unnecessary, Lord Terran, you would not sound afraid. Silence. Then the channel cut. Irene gave a low whistle. You really don't believe in gentle conversations, do you? I do, she said. This is not one. The stolen records had left them a trail after all, not in the logs but in the absences. A courier craft had departed during the confusion under a maintenance identity that no longer existed. Too clean, too hurried. The analyst in the council chamber had traced its trajectory to the debris shadow beyond the station's defense net, which was why Irene now flew his overworked freighter toward a dead traffic zone filled with broken satellites, old cargo plating, and enough radiation static to make sensors complain like poets. There, Aaron said, A faint signal moved between two derelict comm arrays. Irene frowned at the scope. That's not a courier. The ship ahead slid into clearer view, narrow, dark-hulled fast, built less for freight than escape. A military shuttle stripped of insignia. Well, Irene said, that is tremendously suspicious. The shuttle accelerated. Rude, he added, and shoved power forward. The Dustrunner surged with all the enthusiasm of an aging beast insulted into action. The hull groaned. One storage latch somewhere aft banged open and shut in outrage. Aaron's hands moved over the auxiliary display. They are charging a burst transmitter. To send what? Whatever they could not erase. Of course. She glanced sideways at him. You are not surprised. At this point, I would only be surprised by a calm afternoon. The shuttle cut through a cloud of metallic debris. Irene followed, threading the Dustrunner between tumbling wreckage that absolutely did not deserve this much trust. A chunk of plating spun past the canopy. Aaron did not flinch. You enjoy this. I enjoy surviving it. There's a difference. You are smiling. That is fear in a stylish hat. The shuttle's transmitter flared. Aaron touched the tactical pain. If they send that burst, it reaches any hidden receiver within 3 sectors. Can we jam it? With your systems? He winced. That bad? She gave him a look. All right, he said, fair. A warning tone snapped across the cabin. Weapons lock. Irene blinked. They have weapons, apparently. Why does every secret plot eventually become my problem? Because, Aaron said, you keep moving toward it. The shuttle fired. A line of blue light slashed past their port side. The Dustrunner rolled hard as Irene yanked the controls. Sparks burst from a side console. Somewhere in the ship, a crate gave up on dignity and fell over. That was extremely unfriendly, he said. Can you return fire? He looked offended. This is a cargo ship. My strongest weapon is poor accounting. Aaron reached beneath the auxiliary panel, opened a sealed compartment Irene swore had not existed a second earlier, and pulled free a slim Telari command spike. He stared. Did my ship just reveal a secret royal slot? I placed it while you were arguing with launch clearance. I was not arguing, I was educating. She inserted the spike into his systems. The displays changed at once, alien code unfolding through his navigation lattice like silver water finding cracks in stone. Irene's mouth opened. What did you just do? I upgraded you. The sensor array sharpened. A targeting option bloomed where none had been before, linked not to weapons but to the Dustrunner's freight tractor grid. He laughed in disbelief. You turned my cargo hauler into a very judgmental tow truck. The shuttle's drive plume is unstable after its burst charge. If you catch it with the tractor beam at the right frequency, it will lose vector control. That is ridiculous. It will work. That, Irene said, is my favorite kind of ridiculous. He swung the freighter wide, let the shuttle think it had gained distance, then cut across its angle through the debris drift. The enemy pilot reacted fast, veering to avoid collision. Too late. Irene triggered the tractor grid. A cone of distorted blue light snapped across the gap and caught the shuttle's stern. Its engines flared wild, then coughed into asymmetrical thrust. The craft spun, clipped a dead antenna mast, and tumbled into the shadow of a broken station ring. Yes, Irene shouted, be humbled by commerce. The shuttle went dark except for emergency power. He exhaled shakily. That was either brilliant or criminal. In some courts, Aaron said, both. They docked against the disabled shuttle with magnetic clamps that sounded more confident than Irene felt. Inside, the air smelled of heat and burned insulation. The corridor lights flickered on low reserve. One man lay injured near the burst transmitter array. Another had sealed himself in the forward compartment. Irene saw the insignia patch first, hidden beneath the collar of the injured one's suit. Council service. Aaron saw it too. Her face did not change, but the temperature of her silence did. The injured man tried to speak and failed. Irene crouched beside him, found the med kit, pressed a patch to the wound. Stay still. The man gripped his wrist weakly. He said it was necessary. Who? Aaron asked. The man's eyes found her and widened with the terrible clarity of someone who had expected distance and found consequence instead. Lord Taryn. There it was, not a ghost in the room, a man in the room. Smiling, measured, careful Lord Taryn, who had feared urgency because urgency shortened the distance between motive and evidence. The sealed forward hatch hissed open. The second man stepped out with a compact pulse pistol in one hand and a data core in the other. He was young, military-cut, terrified enough to be dangerous. "Stay back," he said. Irene raised both hands. "I was just about to suggest everyone become less dramatic." The man's gaze fixed on Aaron. "He said you were weakening the corridors, that you were turning the throne toward negotiation, toward humans, toward the Empire." Aaron stepped forward once, and so he chose murder. He chose survival. "No," she said. "He chose fear and named it wisdom." The man's hand trembled on the weapon. Irene saw it before she did, or maybe she saw and trusted anyway. Either way, he moved. He didn't think. That had been the beginning of everything, and apparently it remained his signature flaw. He lunged, hit the man at the shoulder, and they crashed into the bulkhead. The pulse pistol fired into the ceiling. Sparks rained down. Irene slammed the man's wrist against the wall until the weapon dropped. They both froze, breathing hard. Irene, pinned halfway across the younger man's chest, said, "You know, I'm starting to feel this station visit has lacked restful moments." The man stared at him in stunned disbelief. Then Aaron took the data core from his loosened grip, and just like that, the fight went out of him. Back on Rimwake, the evidence ended the argument faster than rhetoric ever could. Access keys, signal authorizations, financial transfers routed through shell guilds, correspondence between Lord Taryn and external hardliners who believed Aaron's willingness to stabilize the border through alliance was weakness. He was arrested before Sunset Cycle. The council chamber changed after that, not in shape, in gravity. The old resistance was still there, but wounded now by proof and by shame. Some opposed her still. Fewer dared disguise it as concern. Irene stood beside Aaron once more as the records were entered and the formal charges declared. This time the room looked at him differently. Not warmly, not yet, but with the complicated recognition reserved for people who had become inconveniently real. Afterward, when the chamber emptied and the station at last seemed to exhale, Aaron found him on an upper transit balcony overlooking the repaired outer ring. "You stayed," she said. He leaned on the railing. "I noticed. You could have left after the council. I also could have become sensible years ago." That drew the small smile again. For a while neither spoke. At last Irene said, "I keep thinking this should have changed you more." "It has. You don't look changed." "I am queen," she said. "We are trained to look inevitable." He laughed softly. "That is the most royal sentence I've ever heard." She came to stand beside him. "Before today I believed I understood loyalty. How it is built, how it is held. But power teaches people to perform devotion. You did not perform anything. You chose, and in choosing, altered the meaning of what followed." He looked out at the stars beyond the station. "I was just trying to save someone. I know." He turned toward her. "And me, what exactly am I supposed to do with all this?" "With what?" He gestured vaguely at the Empire, the station, her, the fact of surviving. "With being. Whatever I am now." Aaron considered him with that same impossible steadiness she had shown on the platform, but now he no longer mistook it for distance. He knew it for attention, for care sharpened by thought. "You are still Irene Vale," she said. "Only now you know that instinct is not lesser than strategy, that one life can redirect systems built to crush choice, that you are capable of standing inside fear without surrendering yourself to it." He looked away because for some reason that was harder to face than assassins. "Well," he said, "when you put it that way I sound almost respectable." "Do not worry," she said. "Your humor continues to interfere. Thank stars. I'd hate to improve too much." Below them traffic resumed through the ring. Repair lights blinked in patient patterns. Rimwake insultingly was surviving. Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then, the declaration remains. He smiled despite himself. Yes, I gathered that. It will trouble many people. I'm beginning to see the charm in that. You may leave if you wish. No command binds you. He studied her, the queen, the woman on the deck, the one who had looked at him in the middle of catastrophe and seen not a tool, not a subject, not an accident, but a fact. He thought of his old life, which had been simpler and smaller and safer in the way empty rooms were safe. Then he said, I think I'd like to stay long enough to see what trouble comes of it. Her ears angled slightly, and he had learned enough now to read the warmth in it. Good, she said. Also, he added, I expect compensation. Her brow lifted. For saving the throne, for the cargo delays, let us remain realistic. She laughed then, openly this time, and the sound moved through the quiet like light through glass. Below them the empire continued, vast and uncertain. Above them the stars remained what they had always been, distant, watchful, waiting for those foolish enough to move toward them. Irene rested his arms on the railing and let out a long breath. He had arrived on Rimwake as a tired man with a freighter, a shipment, and modest ambitions. He would leave it, whenever he left it, as someone who understood that history was not always made by the powerful in their chambers. Sometimes it was made by the exhausted, the unprepared, the ordinary people who reached out before they knew the price. Beside him stood a queen who had nearly died nameless in the dark, and had risen from it unwilling to let the old language of power remain unchanged. Together they looked out over a repaired station, a shaken court, and a future neither of them would have chosen in advance. Which, Irene suspected, was exactly why it mattered. Well, he said at last, next time I save your life I'd appreciate fewer politics afterward. Aaron glanced at him. Next time, he grimaced. That was poor phrasing. Yes, she said, but you are mine. I suppose I will keep you. He laughed, and this time, when the words echoed into the night between the stars, they no longer sounded like a sentence. They sounded like a beginning.